When you think of the Apostle Paul, just be honest with me, what is the first image that pops into your head?
I think for most people, and myself included for a long time, it's that classic stained glass version. You know the one I mean.
Oh, yeah.
He's depicted as this high-minded intellectual. Maybe he's in flowing robes, sitting at a perfect desk with a quill, writing these dense, heavy letters that, confuse seminary students to this day.
Right. Or the stern theologian laying down the law.
Exactly. That's the image.
That is the statue in the Vatican. That's the guy in all the paintings. But today, we are going to take that image and, well, completely shatter it. Because the source material we're looking at, which draws on a pretty deep theological lecture series, it paints a wildly different picture.
It really does. It's a complete 180. Instead of the guy in the robes, the source asks us to imagine a man in his 50s, which, by the way, was basically old age back then,
Right.
doing backbreaking manual labor on the docks. We're talking about a guy sleeping in these rough worker dormitories, sweating it out alongside the poorest of the poor.
That is such a massive shift in perspective. It's hard to reconcile the intellectual giant with the guy sweating on a dock. And that really is our mission for this deep dive. We're not just looking at his theology, we're unpacking this hidden side of Paul, what the source calls his labor mission, his absolute brawl to keep Christianity from becoming just another Jewish sect, and his master plan to conquer the Roman Empire from the inside out.
And to do that, we have to look at history through a very specific lens the source material gives us. They use the lens of Jubilee, economic justice and covenant. And it really changes the story from a religious debate to more of a social revolution.
So let's start with the physical reality of this, because I think this is where the source is most surprising. Let's unpack this blue-collar apostle idea. We've all heard Paul was a tent maker.
Right.
And I think most of us imagine him doing, a little light sewing in the corner while he preaches, a side hustle to pay for lunch.
Like a hobby or something he did for an hour a day. But the source argues it was. It was nothing like that. You have to remember the context here. Paul was operating in these huge port cities like Corinth and Ephesus.
Okay.
Tent making is a bit of a polite translation. The reality is that he was likely doing stevedore work.
Stevedore work. Okay, so
Yeah.
for everyone listening, break that down for us. What does that actually mean in the first century?
We're talking about dock work, hauling cargo off ships, working with heavy, thick leather and rough canvas for massive ship sails or commercial awnings. This is heavy lifting. It's cutting and stitching really tough material that requires serious arm strength. It's just grueling physical work.
And the source emphasizes his age again here. He's in his 50s. Why does the lecturer make such a big deal about that?
Well, you have to think about the life expectancy, the physical toll of life back then. 50 is elderly. Most men that age, if they even survived, are slowing way down. They're taking mentorship roles, sitting in the shade. But here's Paul doing what the speaker in our source compares to modern nogada.
I'm not familiar with that term.
It's a Korean term. It refers to that rough day labor construction work, the kind of job where you get paid daily cash for just breaking your back.
Okay, I see.
The speaker in the source actually says he tried that kind of work himself recently and found it absolutely exhausting. And he's likely younger and, better fed than Paul ever was. He realized Paul's work, without any modern tools, was probably even harder.
So he's waking up before dawn, working 10 hours of manual labor, and then he's teaching philosophy and theology late into the night.
Yes.
That just seems unnecessary. I mean, he was a leader, a famous one. Leaders in Jerusalem, other religious figures, they relied on donations or patronage. Peter had people supporting him. Why would Paul choose to do this? Was he just that stubborn?
It wasn't just stubbornness. It was a whole theological statement. The source calls it the theology of self-reliance. Paul absolutely refused to be a burden. His operating principle was basically, my problem is my responsibility.
My problem is my responsibility. That runs completely counter to how religious leaders usually operated, doesn't it?
Completely. A philosopher or a teacher would find a wealthy patron, a sponsor, who'd pay their bills in exchange for, prestige. It was a client-patron system. Paul rejected that completely.
So it was more than just pride.
Oh, much deeper. The source explains Paul's logic like this. I solve my own economic needs so that I can support those who physically cannot work, the disabled, the sick, the weak.
So by working, he creates a surplus that he can then use to help the community.
Exactly. He wasn't working just to survive. He was working to fund a kind of welfare system. And this brings us to that famous and often really misused line, if a man will not work, he shall not eat.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I hear that quoted constantly in political debates, usually to, shame the poor.
It's almost always torn out of its context, and the source clarifies this beautifully. Paul wasn't talking to the needy or the people who couldn't work. He was talking to the free riders.
The free riders, who were they?
Well, you had these people in the early church, especially in Thessalonica, who thought, hey, Jesus is coming back any day now, so why bother working? The kingdom is here.
Right, so they just checked out of society.
They checked out and were just sponging off the community. Paul's labor was a rebuke to them. He was saying, look at me. I'm the apostle. I'm an old man, and I'm still sweating on the docks. What's your excuse?
It's leadership by extreme example. He's taking away any possible excuse they might have.
And in doing that, he's actually acting out the concept of Jubilee.
You mentioned Jubilee earlier. Can you define that for us? Because that's a specific Jewish tradition, right?
Right. In the Old Testament, the Jubilee is this huge economic reset every 50 years. Debts are forgiven, slaves are freed, land goes back to its original owners. It's a clean slate.
And people usually wait for a miracle or a government decree for that.
Exactly. But Paul was doing it practically. He was creating economic justice through daily grit. He slept in the worker dorms, he preached the gospel there, and he showed them a whole new way to live. Not by taking, but by earning and then sharing.
That is such a grounded way to look at a spiritual leader. He's building a new economy from the bottom up with his own two hands. He wasn't just fighting for economic independence. He was in a massive theological war, too.
Oh, yeah.
And that takes us to the second part of our deep dive, this fight for the soul of Christianity.
This is, I would argue, the most critical moment in early church history. We're talking about the crisis in Galatia.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was the conflict? Was it just like internal politics?
It was an existential threat. The conflict was with this group they called the Judaizers. These were Jewish Christians who insisted that if a Gentile, a non-Jew, wanted to follow Jesus, they first had to become Jewish.
So conversion to Judaism was step one to being a Christian?
Step one. They had to be circumcised, keep the Sabbath, follow all the strict dietary laws. Their argument was basically, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, so the club rules are still the old Jewish rules.
I can see how that would be a problem for, a Roman guy in Galatia. Hey, welcome to the faith now about that surgery.
It was a huge barrier. But for Paul, this wasn't just a marketing problem. He saw it as a death sentence for the entire faith. And the source makes this point very, very clearly. If Gentiles had to become Jews to be Christians, Christianity would just stay a tiny sect within Judaism. It would get trapped in the fence of Judaism and likely just disappear.
So what did he do? Because the source mentions he went nuclear.
He really did. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul does not pull any punches. He issues an anathema, which is a formal curse.
A curse on who?
On anyone changing the message. He literally writes, if anyone preaches a different gospel to you than what we preached, let him be accursed. And then he doubles down. He says, even if an angel from heaven preaches a different gospel, let him be accursed.
Even an angel from heaven. That is intense. He's basically putting his authority above celestial beings.
And it gets even more personal. The source recounts this face-to-face confrontation he has with Peter Cephas, the rock of the church.
Oh, is this the incident where Peter stops eating with the Gentiles?
Yes. It's a really dramatic scene. Peter was eating with Gentile converts, which was this huge taboo-breaking sign of unity. It's him saying, we are all one family.
Okay.
But then some hardliners from Jerusalem show up, these Judaizers, and Peter gets scared of what they'll think.
Yeah.
So he withdraws. He segregates himself again. And then Barnabas, Paul's own mentor, follows Peter's lead.
Wow, talk about peer pressure. If Peter and Barnabas are caving, the fight is basically over, right? I mean, they're the pillars.
It would have been if Paul hadn't stepped in.
Yeah.
And the source highlights the immense courage this must have taken. Remember, Paul was the outsider here, the latecomer. Peter was inner circle. He walked with Jesus. But Paul stood up and publicly called them out to their faces. He knew if he didn't fight this, the survival of the faith was on the line. He saw the global picture when everyone else was just looking at local politics.
But if he wins that fight, if you don't need the Jewish law, the diet, the circumcision, then what are the rules? Doesn't that just lead to chaos?
That was the fear. And Paul had to solve this massive theological puzzle. He had to redefine the entire structure. The source explains that Paul argued for a law of conscience.
A law of conscience, what's that?
It's this idea of a contract law being written on the heart. He argued that Abraham was the father of the faithful because of his faith, not just his bloodline, and that for Gentiles, the law wasn't some external checklist of rituals, but an internal moral compass guided by the Spirit.
This connects back to that idea of covenant that the source mentioned earlier, doesn't it?
It does, and this is a bit of a theological pivot, but stay with me, because the source makes a really crucial distinction here. It separates redemption history from covenant history.
Okay, let's unpack that. I feel like redemption and covenant get used interchangeably a lot. What's the difference here?
Well, think of redemption as rescue. It's the idea that Jesus saved us, pulled us out of the fire, and it's done. I'm safe. Covenant, on the other hand, is a contract. It's a relationship.
Contract implies duties. It implies two sides have to do something.
Precisely. Redemption is, I am saved. Covenant is, okay, now I have a job to do. It means we have a responsibility to live out justice and righteousness in the world.
So why does that distinction matter so much for Paul?
It explains his entire behavior. If it was just about redemption, Paul could have just retired. He was saved. He could have sat on a beach. But he saw himself as being in a covenant. He had to fulfill his side of a contract between God, humans, and creation. And that ties right back to why he worked on the docks. He wasn't just a passive recipient of grace. He was an active agent fulfilling his part of the deal.
It makes his whole life seem so much more active. He's not just waiting for heaven. He's trying to build something here on earth. And speaking of building, let's talk strategy. The source calls him a grand strategist.
This is where we see Paul the visionary. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly around the Mediterranean hoping people would listen. He had a map in his head. His ambition was to reach the major pillars of the Roman world. Antioch, Ephesus, Alexandria was probably on the list, Rome, and then eventually Spain.
He wanted to go global.
He wanted to plant hubs. He knew if he could establish strong communities in these major urban centers, the message would just flow out to the surrounding regions automatically. It's a hub and spoke model.
And the big case study for this is Ephesus. The source says he stayed there for over a year and a half, which was a really long time for him.
Ephesus was the testing ground. And look at his move there. He starts in the synagogue, speaking to Jews. But when that hits a wall, where does he go? The source says he moved to the Hall of Tyrannus.
That sounds like a university lecture hall or something.
That's basically what it was, a secular Greek philosophical venue. This is a massive shift. He stopped speaking Jewish to Greeks. He started engaging with Greek philosophy and culture on their own turf. The source suggests this is where he and later John started using concepts like logos to explain Jesus. He was translating the message.
He was so effective at it that he caused a riot. I love this story, the riot of the silversmiths.
It's a classic example of unintended consequences. So Ephesus was home to the massive temple of Artemis. And there was this huge industry of silversmiths making little idol statues to sell to tourists and pilgrims.
Big business, like selling souvenirs at Disney World or something.
Huge business. And Paul messed with their bottom line. But here's the key detail the source points out. Paul never directly insulted Artemis. He didn't go around smashing statues or picketing the temple yelling, Artemis is fake.
Really? I always assumed he was out there causing a scene, tearing things down.
No. The source notes that when he was dragged in front of the authorities, the town clerk actually defends him. He says these men are not temple robbers nor blasphemers of your goddess. Paul just preached his own truth, his Jubilee gospel, so effectively that people naturally just stopped buying idols.
He disrupted the market.
He did. The demand just dried up. And when you mess with people's money, that's when they get angry. That's what caused the riot. It wasn't theological offense, it was economic panic.
That is fascinating. It shows how practical and real world his impact was. It wasn't just ideas floating in the air. It literally changed how people spent their money.
And that brings us to a really profound insight from the source about Paul's adaptability. Paul famously said in Philippians, I know how to be abased, meaning how to be poor, and I know how to abound, how to be rich or successful.
Right. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We see that verse on coffee mugs everywhere.
The source interprets this very differently. It's not about superhuman strength to win a football game. It's about the ability to adapt to any circumstance without losing your soul. And here's where it gets really interesting. The source argues that knowing how to abound, knowing how to handle wealth and success, is actually harder than knowing how to be poor.
Wait, really? Being rich is harder than being poor? I think a lot of listeners struggling to pay rent might strongly disagree with that. Poverty is physically brutal.
It is, and the source acknowledges that physical hardship. But the argument is about spiritual difficulty. Poverty crushes the body, but wealth tends to corrupt the character. It creates arrogance. It creates a false sense of security. It makes you think you don't need the covenant anymore.
I see. So the argument is that staying true to the mission while you're swimming in money and success requires a stronger internal character than just surviving hard times.
Exactly. Just look at lottery winners or sudden celebrities. They so often self-destruct. Paul's superpower, according to the source, was his ability to handle both. He could work the docks in poverty, and he could stand in the halls of power without ever changing who he was.
Incredible.
He didn't sell out when he succeeded, and he didn't give up when he was broke.
That's the real I can do all things. It's the ultimate flexibility.
Yes, it's the resilience to keep the covenant no matter what your bank account looks like.
So let's wrap this up. We've gone from the sweaty docks to high-stakes theological arguments to riots in Ephesus. When you step back and look at this hidden Paul, what's the big takeaway?
The takeaway is that Paul wasn't just a theologian. He was the practical architect of a global movement. Without his stubborn insistence on faith over law, that whole fight in Galatia Christianity would have just remained a small Jewish subgroup and, likely disappeared from history.
And without his labor mission.
Without that, the church might have become a burden on society instead of a blessing to it. He set the DNA of the movement. Solve your own problems, then help others. He broke the ethnic barrier, and he broke the class barrier.
It's amazing to think about. We owe so much of what the Western world became to this one guy's stubbornness and his strategy.
Absolutely. He totally redefined what it meant to be a leader.
Now, before we go, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought from the source that really stuck with me. We talked about how modern leaders, and maybe us too, struggle more with knowing how to be rich than knowing how to be poor.
It's a very provocative idea.
If Paul's gospel required him to solve his own problems, to live simply so he could help others, what does that say about our modern definition of success, whether that's in leadership or religion or just our own lives? We're so often chasing sponsorship or accumulation, trying to get to a place where we don't have to work.
But Paul implies the work and that connection to reality is part of the contract.
Exactly. So as you go about your week, maybe think about your own contract with the world. Are you waiting for a jubilee or are you building one?
That's the question.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.